I want to discuss then the next chapter, chapter 36. This is a much more complicated matter, which is corporate governance and corporate formation. And we're going to be here for a couple of chapters indeed. My approach is not to make you into a lawyer. My approach is to simply give you a sense, an oversight of this material. And because in reality, if your company or you need information about how the corporate liability issue falls, you're going to be contacting an attorney. This is a very complicated area when you create your own entity. You're not the corporation is not you. It's essentially giving birth to a child that can't vote or ever vote, thank goodness. So think about the time in terms of spent here, the time spent here, in that you'll be going over definitions the book provides, and I'll be giving some guidance that's very brief. And I think at this stage, if you do have specific questions, you should email me because then I can dive better into your questions than just simply here on a video. The beginning talks about the nature of a corporation being a person. Indeed, that's true. There's a lot of things that corporations can do, such as even free speech rights, that an individual also can do. As I said, typically there's about two things a corporation cannot do. It can't adopt people, natural people, and it can't vote. Again, thank goodness. But the corporation can employ people. It can buy land. It can seek investments. There's all sorts of things this particular vehicle can do. It is very complicated, both by state law and by the way federal governments treat them. So again, if you run into this problem in your business, you want to have the guidance of an attorney. There are ways on page 3 of the slide to what's called pierce the corporate veil, or to show that it's a sham or shell corporation. So it's not like you can say, well, let me just simply set up this company so it will fail, and then that way my liability is shielded. I'm not going to be liable. I'm immune from lawsuits. That's not necessarily the case. The courts have the ability to lift that or pierce that veil and to say this was a sham, and really the people responsible are the owners, the shareholders, those such as they are who are trying to avoid liability. I have actually, as an attorney, handled one of those cases, and it was difficult to convince the court that the company was set up to fail. But eventually we got to a point where I think the owner of the company realized the court was going to pierce the veil, lift the veil, and make him personally liable. And at that stage, the owner began to talk about settling the matter, which my client was willing to do. It did not come to a final decision, in other words. The issue about personnel is something I can help you with. Perhaps the best information here would be to illustrate this in the form of a boat. Think of a ship as a vessel, much like a company is a vessel. But the ship does certain things. It works. It carries passengers. It carries goods and all sorts of things. On the one side, you have the board of directors who are controlling where the ship is going. So you could say the board, these are my stick figures, are pointing the direction for the ship to sail. So here's our vessel, and over here is where it's going to land. The board doesn't deal with specific day-to-day functions, but the board is important to direct the company. So if there is a banking issue, in which bank do we bank? Typically that would be a board decision, but the handling of the accounts every day would not be. So who is on the ship? Well, there's the president, CFO, CEO. There's all sorts of names for these individuals who then basically day-to-day run the operations of that vessel, and in this case our company. There's treasurer, secretaries. There's typical leaders of this kind who then handle that ship so that they sail through certain seas. If they run into a storm, the president has the ability to steer the vessel around that, change direction, in other words, in spite of what the board pointed to, in spite of what the board wishes, because the board's not there on that vessel. They're not there day to day. So the president has the ability to maneuver, but ultimately the goal is to follow the director's orders and do the job, such as bring the goods over to that particular location. So we have basic idea here of the nature of corporate personnel. I think it works very well as a metaphor. But the one question that's lacking is, well, where are the shareholders? Where are the owners of this enterprise? And they sit back over here. They're very passive. They don't get to do much but vote for the directors. There's a number of shareholder rights derived from this structure. We'll get into a brief amount of them in this discussion, but they're very much in the shadows. They are just giving the money. They're just putting in the investment, creating the board to then move this vessel and basically carry forward the projects and jobs that this company is supposed to do. So do think of this metaphor as a discussion for page 4 on this slide, and page 5 and so on. The companies are themselves taxed. Both state and federal law allows this because the company is its own individual entity. It's a separate person, has its own tax number, its own employer ID number. So there are different ways, though, based upon what kind of company you have, how that tax works. For instance, if you have what's called a regular or C Corp, you're taxed once as a corporation, and as the individual shareholders receive dividends and their investments back. As I said, they're sort of passive eyewitnesses to this whole affair. The individual shareholder is also personally taxed. But there's other ways that you can avoid tax liability. So we go back to the earlier chapters, chapter 34 and 35, where we said the sole proprietorship and the partnership, and even the limited partnership, is not really the best vehicle to steer the issue of taxation, to control the tax that's being applied or levied against the owners. But the company is. The company is able to issue dividends, not issue dividends, or if it's a different type of company, such as the subchapter S or a few others, the taxation the tax issue can be controlled. The tax issue can be dealt with better. Just want to mention corporations on page 9. Don't really go to jail, but their officers can. This is corporate officer criminal liability doctrine. And so you can go throughout the book and you can find information specific to that that's not necessarily in this chapter. The chapter on crime, which we did not cover in this course, there's another chapter as well that discusses how corporate officers can be criminally liable, because you can't put a non-entity, an entity that has no corporal being, no hands, no flesh, no blood, in a jail system that's physical. But a corporation can be fined and also can be dissolved for criminal activity. The rest of this is basically definitions for you. A couple of issues I want to highlight as we look at it, though, which is the issue of how a company can act that may not have fully incorporated. It might be that the shareholders and the incorporator or the promoters have not fully legalized the company. The courts have the ability to work around some improper incorporation issues. So I want to refer you to page 30 in the slide. The courts actually have the ability to say you are a company, even though perhaps you've not checked all the boxes in legally forming that company with the state corporation commissions. That's a de facto rule. So the courts can say, well, maybe you didn't get everything done, but you are a company, and for all purposes, we're going to treat you like a company. There's also corporation by estoppel. This has happened to me once. I had an entity that was saying that, well, you can't attack the company. I'm sorry, you can't attack me because there was a company that existed. And the idea was that we said, no, actually, we're going to claim that you're liable because the company failed a number of aspects, and you didn't act like a company, you didn't behave like a company, even though you called it. The facts are more clear in this, in the way that the individual went around calling himself an Inc. and a Co. And so he would have his name, and at the end of that title, he would put down Incorporated. And there were some documents the individual had started filing, but in fact, the individual did not act like a company. He would do whatever he wanted to do. There were no shareholder meetings, there were no board of directors meetings, there were no board of directors appointed. So he was trying to act like a company, but he was really not. He claimed that in de facto he was a company and that everybody should treat him that way. He was claiming a de facto company. And we said, no, you cannot act, you did not act like a company, and therefore you cannot call yourself a company. So the doctrine here on page 30 says, by estoppel, if you act like a company, you cannot avoid liability at all by claiming that no corporation exists. That also acts in the reverse, and that's what I want to mention, is that if you are acting like an individual, claiming it's a company, you can't go out there and say, well, it's the company that should be paying or liable for this, when indeed there really isn't a company. So by estoppel, the individual was stopped from claiming that there was a company involved, and he was personally liable. So the estoppel doctrine works, in a sense, both ways, even though your book doesn't get into it. I think that's basically it, except for the nature of the stocks that the company issues. And again, here we have definitions that you can read yourself. Here there is much more complexity, and again, the larger the company, the more investments, the more you're going to see corporate stock issuance become complicated. You're going to see much more of a very convoluted, even sometimes, how those stocks are working, how the stockholder stock votes. Some can't vote, some can vote only after certain types of stock vote. It is actually very complicated in terms of how the company is structured through these stocks through the stock issuances. I think that's all I'm going to do on this one. Again, this is mostly definitions. It's an overview for you. We're going to move to the next chapter.